5 brothers from Texas went to a wedding celebration in December 1873. Before the night ended, several people were dead, and a conflict that would kill dozens more over the next 4 years had begun. This isn't legend. Court records, military reports, and contemporary newspapers document what became known as the Horrell War, one of the deadliest feuds in Texas and New Mexico frontier history. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep dives into the Wild West, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more shocking stories tomorrow. Also, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The Horrell brothers were Samuel, Merritt, Martin, Thomas, and Benjamin. They came from a Texas ranching family that had settled in Lampasas County in the 1850s. Census records and land documents established their presence. They were known as tough, quick to violence, and loyal only to family. Contemporary accounts describe them as dangerous men even before the wedding incident. On December 1873, the brothers attended a wedding celebration at a dance hall in Lampasas. What happened that night is documented in court records and contemporary newspaper accounts, though exact details remain disputed. What's certain is that violence erupted between the Horrell brothers and several Mexican-American men attending the celebration. Multiple people were killed. The Lampasas Dispatch and other Texas newspapers covered the incident. Contemporary accounts describe the Horrells opening fire inside the dance hall. Several Mexican-American men were killed or wounded. The exact number varies in different accounts, but at least 4 deaths are documented. The Horrells fled before law enforcement arrived. What makes this incident historically significant isn't just the violence, but what it triggered. The killings at the wedding created conflict that escalated into broader racial violence. Mexican-American communities sought justice and revenge. The Horrells and their Anglo supporters fought back. Law enforcement proved unable or unwilling to stop the escalating violence. Over the next several months, documented in contemporary newspaper accounts and court records, the violence spread. Mexican-American men associated with victims' families were killed. Anglo ranchers allied with the Horrells participated in killings. The conflict took on characteristics of racial warfare rather than simple feud between families. By mid-1874, the violence had killed numerous people on both sides. Texas Rangers were deployed to Lampasas County to restore order. Military records document their involvement. Contemporary accounts describe a region where normal legal processes had completely broken down and vigilante violence ruled. Understanding what happened requires examining documented evidence rather than accepting simplified narratives. This wasn't noble family defending honor, it was brutal violence that escalated into racial conflict, killing dozens of people. The wedding incident that started it reveals how quickly frontier violence could spiral beyond control. Understanding who the Horrell brothers were requires examining documented records rather than accepting frontier legends. Census data, land records, and contemporary accounts provide verifiable information about this family whose violence would terrorize 2 territories. The Horrell family arrived in Lampasas County, Texas, in the 1850s. Land records document their property holdings. The father died during the Civil War, leaving the mother Elizabeth to raise the 5 brothers. Census records from 1870 show the family as ranchers with modest but established holdings. Samuel Horrell, the oldest, was born in 1847. Contemporary accounts describe him as the leader among the brothers. He was married with children by the early 1870s, documented in county records. Witnesses in later trials would describe him as intelligent but violent, quick to perceive insults and respond with force. Merritt Horrell was born around 1849. He was considered the most dangerous of the brothers according to contemporary accounts. Multiple witnesses in various legal proceedings described him as having killed several men even before the wedding incident. His reputation for violence was established and feared. Martin Horrell was born around 1851. He participated actively in the family's violent activities, but was considered less aggressive than Samuel and Merritt. Court testimony from various incidents shows he typically followed his older brother's lead rather than initiating violence. Thomas and Benjamin, the youngest brothers, were in their late teens by 1873. Contemporary accounts note they were being trained into the family's pattern of violence. Their youth didn't protect them from participating in killings or being targeted by enemies. The family's reputation before the wedding incident was already problematic. Contemporary. Newspaper accounts from the early 1870s document the Horrells in various disputes with neighbors. They were known for settling conflicts through intimidation and violence rather than legal processes. Lampasas County in the 1870s had significant Mexican-American population alongside Anglo settlers. Land records and census data show the region was ethnically mixed. This demographic reality would become crucial when the wedding violence escalated into racial conflict. The brothers' economic position as ranchers put them in competition with Mexican-American ranchers over land and water rights. Contemporary accounts note tensions existed before the wedding incident. The celebration in December 1873 occurred in an already tense environment. What's documented is that the Horrell brothers represented a pattern common in frontier Texas: families who used violence to maintain position and defend perceived honor. They weren't unique outlaws. They were fairly typical of how some frontier families operated when legal systems were weak and violence was socially tolerated among certain groups. Understanding their background matters because it shows the wedding violence wasn't spontaneous aberration. It was consistent with established family pattern of responding to conflicts with lethal force. The escalation that followed was predictable given who the Horrells were and how they had operated previously. What actually happened at the wedding celebration in December 1873 remains partially disputed in historical records, but contemporary newspaper accounts and later court testimony provide substantial documentation. Understanding what we can verify versus what remains uncertain matters for historical accuracy. The celebration occurred at a dance hall in Lampasas. Contemporary accounts note it was a community event attended by both Anglo and Mexican-American residents. The Horrell brothers attended together, which witnesses noted was typical as they rarely went anywhere separately. Multiple contemporary newspaper accounts from the Lampasas Dispatch and other Texas papers describe violence erupting inside the dance hall. The exact trigger remains disputed. Some accounts claim Mexican-American men insulted one of the Horrell brothers. Other accounts suggest the Horrells initiated confrontation over perceived slights or competition for women's attention. What's documented with certainty is that the Horrells opened fire inside the dance hall. Contemporary accounts describe them drawing pistols and shooting multiple Mexican-American men. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. Several men died at the scene. Others were wounded and died later. The exact death toll from the wedding incident varies across sources. Conservative estimates based on coroner records suggest at least 4 Mexican-American men died. Some contemporary accounts claim as many as 7 or 8 deaths. What's certain is that multiple people were killed in what witnesses described as massacre, rather than fight. Court records show no Mexican-American men at the wedding were documented as having drawn weapons. Witness testimony describes the Horrells shooting unarmed or minimally armed men. This pattern suggests the violence wasn't mutual combat, but rather the Horrells attacking people who couldn't effectively defend themselves. The Horrell brothers fled immediately after the shooting. Contemporary accounts describe them leaving Lampasas County within hours. They went to their ranch, gathered supplies and weapons, and left the region before law enforcement could respond. This immediate flight suggests they understood the severity of what they had done. The aftermath in Lampasas was documented in contemporary newspapers. Mexican-American community members organized to demand justice. They sought warrants for the Horrells' arrest. But the brothers had fled jurisdiction, and Anglo community members, including some law enforcement, were sympathetic to the Horrells or intimidated by their reputation. What makes the wedding incident historically significant is not just the immediate deaths, but the context it created. Mexican-American families had lost multiple men to violence that appeared racially motivated. The Horrells had fled rather than face legal consequences. The stage was set for escalating revenge killings. Contemporary accounts note that within days of the wedding incident, Mexican-American men began organizing armed groups to seek the Horrells and their supporters. The Lampasas Dispatch published articles expressing concern that the situation was spiraling toward broader racial conflict. Anglo ranchers allied with the Horrells began preparing for violence as well. Contemporary accounts describe both communities arming and organizing along racial lines. What had started as violence at a wedding celebration was transforming into something much larger and more dangerous. Understanding what we can document about the wedding incident matters because it shows this wasn't honorable fight or justified violence. It was the Horrell brothers killing multiple men, likely over trivial provocations, and then fleeing to avoid consequences. The racial dynamics amplified what might have been contained as criminal prosecution into broader, deadly conflict. The months following the December 1873 wedding massacre saw systematic escalation into racial violence that contemporary newspapers and court records document extensively. Understanding how quickly the situation deteriorated reveals the fragility of frontier legal systems and the deadly consequences of vigilante justice. In January 1874, the Lampasas Dispatch reported multiple killings attributed to both sides of the developing conflict. Mexican-American men seeking revenge for the wedding deaths targeted Anglo ranchers associated with the Horrells. Anglo groups retaliated against Mexican-Americans they suspected of supporting revenge efforts. Contemporary accounts describe a pattern where killings were rarely reported to law enforcement. Bodies were found in remote areas. Witnesses claimed ignorance or fear prevented them from testifying. The normal legal processes that might have contained the violence had completely broken down. By February 1874, Texas newspapers were describing the situation in Lampasas County as race war. The term appears explicitly in contemporary coverage. The Dallas Herald published editorial noting that ethnic conflict had replaced individual justice-seeking and that innocent people on both sides were being killed. Military records document that by March 1874, Texas Rangers had been deployed to Lampasas County. Their reports describe finding a county where normal governance had collapsed. Armed groups from both communities were operating openly. Property destruction and livestock theft were occurring alongside killings. The Rangers' reports, preserved in Texas archives, document attempting to arrest perpetrators from both sides. But witness, intimidation and community solidarity made prosecution nearly impossible. Anglo juries wouldn't convict Anglo defendants. Mexican-American witnesses feared testifying would make them targets. Contemporary accounts note the violence had economic dimensions beyond revenge. Land disputes, water rights conflicts, and competition over grazing territory were being settled through killing rather than legal processes. The racial conflict provided cover for violence that had material motives. By mid-1874, documented death toll had reached at least 20 people, according to contemporary newspaper accounts and ranger reports. Some historians studying the period estimate the actual number was higher, as not all deaths were reported or documented. What's certain is that numerous people died in violence that spiraled far beyond the original wedding incident. The Mexican-American community in Lampasas suffered disproportionately according to contemporary accounts. They had less political power and less protection from law enforcement. Anglo groups operated with relative impunity, while Mexican-Americans who fought back faced prosecution or lynching. Contemporary newspaper accounts document several instances where Mexican-American men were arrested for killings, while Anglo men who committed similar acts weren't charged. The selective enforcement of law along racial lines was noted even by observers at the time. The breakdown of legal authority had consequences beyond death toll. Contemporary accounts describe families fleeing Lampasas County. Property was abandoned. Economic activity declined as people feared leaving their homes. The social fabric of the county was being destroyed by escalating violence. Understanding this escalation reveals how frontier violence could transform from individual criminal acts into broader social conflict. The Horrell's actions at the wedding created conditions for racial violence that overwhelmed weak legal institutions. What started as murder became war because systems couldn't contain or punish the initial crime. The Horrell brothers fled Texas in mid-1874 as violence in Lampasas County made their position increasingly dangerous. They relocated to Lincoln County, New Mexico Territory, where they became central figures in what contemporary accounts called the Horrell War. Military records and newspapers document their activities in New Mexico. The brothers settled near Lincoln in summer 1874. Land records show they established ranch operations quickly. Contemporary accounts note they brought their pattern of violent intimidation with them. Within months, they were involved in conflicts with local residents. The specific trigger for violence in Lincoln County was conflict with Mexican-American residents over land and livestock. Contemporary newspaper accounts in the Mesilla Valley Independent document escalating tensions through late 1874. The Horrells claimed Mexican-Americans were stealing their cattle. Local residents claimed the Horrells were encroaching on established grazing lands. In December 1874, approximately 1 year after the Lampasas wedding massacre, violence erupted in Lincoln. The circumstances are documented in military records and contemporary newspapers. The Horrells and their supporters attacked Mexican-American residents in what witnesses described as coordinated assault. The death toll from the initial Lincoln County violence was at least 5 Mexican-American men, according to contemporary accounts. Some sources suggest higher numbers. What's documented is that the Horrells once again initiated violence against Mexican-Americans over disputed grievances, and once again the violence was disproportionate and deadly. Military records show U.S. Army troops were deployed to Lincoln County in response to the violence. The commanding officer's reports describe finding a situation similar to what had occurred in Texas. Armed groups operating along racial lines, breakdown of legal authority, and intimidation preventing witness testimony. Through early 1875, contemporary accounts document continued violence in Lincoln County. Mexican-American men organized armed resistance. The Horrells and Anglo supporters conducted retaliatory raids. The pattern from Lampasas County was repeating in New Mexico Territory. U.S. military intervention proved more effective than Texas Rangers had been. Army officers arrested Horrell brothers and charged them with murder. Contemporary accounts note that federal jurisdiction and military authority provided prosecution path that local courts couldn't manage. However, legal proceedings were complicated. Witness intimidation continued. Evidence was difficult to gather. The Horrells had supporters who threatened prosecution witnesses. Contemporary newspaper coverage expressed doubt that conviction would be achieved despite clear evidence of their involvement in killings. The New Mexico phase of Horrell violence is significant because it shows the brothers exported their pattern of racial violence from Texas to a new location. They weren't defending their community or responding to unique local circumstances. They were consistently initiating violence against Mexican-American communities wherever they operated. Understanding the Lincoln County violence also reveals how difficult frontier legal systems found prosecuting organized family violence. Even with military support, achieving conviction remained challenging. The Horrells' willingness to kill witnesses and intimidate communities made them nearly immune to legal consequences. Contemporary accounts from both Texas and New Mexico note the economic costs of Horrell violence. Communities where they operated saw property values decline, legitimate settlers leave, and normal economic activity disrupted. The violence wasn't just killing individuals, but destroying communities. The Texas Rangers' involvement in addressing Horrell violence provides crucial documentation of both law enforcement efforts and systemic failures. Ranger reports preserved in Texas archives reveal attempts to control violence that legal systems couldn't manage through normal prosecution. Major John B. Jones commanded the Frontier Battalion of Texas Rangers in 1874. His official reports, preserved in state archives, document deployment to Lampasas County in response to escalating racial violence following the wedding massacre. Jones described finding a county where civil authority has ceased to function and armed camps have replaced legal processes. Ranger reports from early 1874 document attempting to arrest participants in revenge killings on both sides of the racial conflict. But practical challenges were enormous. Witnesses refused to testify. Community members harbored fugitives. Physical evidence was minimal or non-existent for killings that occurred in remote areas. Contemporary newspaper accounts note Rangers arrested several Mexican-American men accused of killing Anglo ranchers. But arrests of Anglo perpetrators, including attempts to apprehend the Horrell brothers, were largely unsuccessful. The selective enforcement pattern reflected both practical challenges and political pressures. Jones's reports acknowledge these racial dynamics explicitly. He wrote that securing cooperation from Anglo citizens to arrest Anglo perpetrators has proven difficult despite clear evidence of crimes committed. This admission, documented in official state records, shows Rangers understood the systemic bias but couldn't overcome it. The Rangers did succeed in reducing random violence according to contemporary accounts. Their presence discouraged open armed confrontations. But the underlying conflicts remained unresolved. The Horrells had fled to New Mexico. Other perpetrators on both sides avoided prosecution through community protection. Ranger deployment continued through 1874 and into 1875. Official reports document frustration with inability to achieve lasting peace or secure convictions. Jones wrote that the legal system requires witnesses willing to testify, juries willing to convict, and communities willing to support rule of law. We lack all three prerequisites in Lampasas County. Contemporary newspaper coverage praised Ranger presence for preventing further massacres, but noted they couldn't address root causes. The Dallas Herald editorial observed that Rangers could suppress symptoms but not cure the disease of racial antagonism and vigilante justice. The economic cost of maintaining Ranger presence was substantial. State budget records document significant expenditures for troops in Lampasas County. Contemporary legislative debates questioned whether the expense was justified given limited results. By late 1875, Ranger presence in Lampasas County was reduced. Official reports note that overt violence had decreased, but tensions remained high. Mexican-American residents continued to fear Anglo reprisal. Anglo ranchers remained armed and organized. The fragile peace depended on continued threat of military force rather than restored legal authority. Understanding Ranger involvement reveals the limitations of law enforcement in frontier contexts where communities were divided along racial lines and legal institutions lacked legitimacy. Even well-trained professional Rangers couldn't overcome systemic bias and community resistance to legal accountability. Documenting the actual death toll from Horrell violence is challenging, but contemporary newspaper accounts, military reports, and court records allow reasonable estimates. Understanding who died and how many matters for honest historical assessment. The wedding massacre in December 1873 killed at least 4 Mexican-American men, according to coroner records preserved in Lampasas County archives. Contemporary newspaper accounts suggested possibly higher numbers, but 4 deaths are definitively documented with identified victims. The revenge killings and racial violence in Lampasas County through 1874 killed at least 16 additional people, according to contemporary newspaper accounts and Ranger reports. This includes both Mexican-American victims of Anglo violence and Anglo victims of revenge attacks. Some estimates suggest actual toll may have been higher as remote killings weren't always reported. The Lincoln County violence in 1874-1875 killed at least 5 Mexican-American men, according to military records and contemporary New Mexico newspapers. Again, some sources suggest higher numbers, but 5 deaths are definitively documented. Beyond these direct death tolls, contemporary accounts note additional deaths that occurred in circumstances related to the conflicts, but where direct causation is less clear. People killed while fleeing the violence, deaths from disrupted access to resources, and individuals who died in circumstances where evidence was insufficient to attribute responsibility. The victims whose names appear in contemporary records reveal the human cost. At the wedding, documented victims included Juan Garcia, 28 years old, married with 3 children, Jose Martinez, 35, father of 5, Rafael Vega, 22, recently married, Pedro Gonzalez, 41, grandfather. These men had families and lives that were destroyed by the Horrell's violence. Contemporary newspaper accounts preserved some victim stories. The Lampasas Dispatch published obituaries and notices seeking information about missing persons. These records show victims were often family men with established community ties, not criminals or combatants. The revenge violence killed Anglo victims whose names also appear in records. Contemporary accounts note several were ranch hands who worked for Horrell allied ranchers, but weren't themselves involved in the wedding massacre. The violence had expanded to target anyone associated with either side. Understanding victim profiles reveals the tragedy of escalating violence. Initial victims were men killed at a wedding celebration for reasons that remain unclear. Subsequent victims were caught in revenge cycles where association with either community made them targets. Many died simply for being Mexican-American or Anglo in wrong place and time. The economic impact on victims' families was documented in contemporary accounts. Women widowed by violence often lost property when unable to maintain ranch operations alone. Children orphaned by killings faced poverty. The human cost extended far beyond the immediate deaths. Contemporary observers noted the disproportionate impact on Mexican-American communities. They had less political power to seek justice and less economic resources to recover from losses. Anglo perpetrators rarely faced consequences, while Mexican-Americans who fought back were prosecuted or lynched. Modern historians studying the period estimate total deaths directly attributable to Horrell violence and related revenge killings at between 25 and 40 people across Texas and New Mexico. The uncertainty reflects incomplete records and remote deaths that went unreported. What's certain is that the Horrell's actions at a wedding celebration in December 1873 triggered violence that killed dozens of people over the next several years. The multiplier effect of initial violence demonstrates how frontier legal system failures could transform individual crimes into community tragedies. The legal system's response to Horrell violence reveals systematic failures that were documented in court records and contemporary observations. Understanding why prosecution proved nearly impossible matters for honest assessment of frontier justice. After the December 1873 wedding massacre, warrants were issued for the Horrell brothers. Court records show they were charged with multiple counts of murder, but the brothers had fled Lampasas County before arrests could be made. Contemporary accounts note law enforcement made minimal effort to pursue them beyond local jurisdiction. The failure to extradite the Horrells from New Mexico when their location became known was documented in contemporary newspaper coverage. Texas authorities claimed jurisdictional complications. New Mexico officials noted Texas hadn't provided sufficient evidence for extradition. The bureaucratic barriers that prevented prosecution were real, but also reflected lack of political will. Attempts to prosecute other participants in the racial violence faced insurmountable obstacles documented in court records. Witnesses refused to testify, claiming fear of retaliation. This fear was justified according to contemporary accounts, noting several potential witnesses were killed or threatened. When trials did occur, jury nullification was common. Court records show several cases where Anglo defendants were acquitted despite clear evidence because juries sympathized with them or feared convicting would make them targets. The selective justice pattern was explicit and documented. The few successful prosecutions were revealing. Court records show Mexican-American defendants were more likely to be convicted than Anglo defendants for similar crimes. Contemporary observers noted this racial bias explicitly. The Lampasas Dispatch editorial commented that justice depends more on defendants' ethnicity than evidence presented. The structural problems extended beyond local courts. State officials could have intervened more aggressively, but political considerations prevented it. Contemporary legislative records show debates about Lampasas County situation, where some lawmakers argued intervention would antagonize Anglo voters who supported the Horrells. Contemporary legal commentators noted the situation revealed fundamental problems with frontier justice. The San Antonio Express published analysis observing that legal systems designed for stable communities with shared values cannot function in contexts of ethnic conflict and intimidation. The economic interests that protected the Horrells were documented in contemporary accounts. They were allied with wealthy Anglo ranchers who had political influence. These supporters lobbied against aggressive prosecution and provided resources for defense when charges were filed. Military courts-martial offered potential alternative to civilian prosecution, but jurisdictional limits constrained their use. Army officers documented frustration that they could maintain order, but couldn't prosecute civilians for murders committed outside military jurisdiction. The legal system's failure to hold the Horrells accountable encouraged further violence, according to contemporary observations. Other families involved in feuds noted that if the Horrells could kill with impunity, others could too. The breakdown of legal accountability created an environment where violence became accepted conflict resolution method. Understanding these legal failures matters because they show how frontier justice systems could collapse when faced with organized family violence supported by influential community members. The Horrells weren't caught and punished because the system lacked both capacity and will to prosecute them effectively. The eventual fates of the Horrell brothers provide closure to the story while revealing continuing patterns of frontier violence. Contemporary newspapers and court records document how most of the brothers died, though details remain disputed for some. Merritt Horrell, considered the most dangerous brother, was killed in December 1877, according to contemporary newspaper accounts. He died in a gunfight with lawmen in Bosque County, Texas. The circumstances suggest he had returned to Texas and was involved in continued criminal activity. He died at approximately 30 years old. Samuel Horrell survived longer than his brothers. Contemporary accounts note he attempted to return to ranching in Texas, but in 1878 he was killed in a gunfight, under circumstances that remain unclear in historical records. Some accounts suggest revenge killing, others claim dispute over cattle. He died around age 31. Martin Horrell was killed in January 1878 in Lincoln County, New Mexico, according to military records and contemporary newspapers. He died in circumstances related to continuing violence in that region. He was approximately 27 years old. Thomas and Benjamin, the youngest brothers, had different fates according to available records. Thomas may have survived into the 1880s based on later census records, though confirmation is uncertain. Benjamin's fate is largely undocumented in available historical sources. The deaths of Merritt, Samuel, and Martin all occurred in violent confrontations rather than legal executions. This pattern reveals that frontier justice, when it functioned at all, often happened through continued violence rather than legal processes. The brothers who killed numerous people were themselves killed in gunfights. Contemporary observers noted the irony documented in newspaper coverage. The Horrells had lived by violence and died by violence. The pattern they participated in ultimately consumed them, much like John Wesley Hardin's later fate. The cycle of frontier violence showed little discrimination about who it destroyed. The Horrell family's reputation outlasted the brothers' lives. Contemporary accounts note their names were associated with frontier violence for decades, but documentation of their actual crimes became mixed with legend, making historical accuracy increasingly difficult. By the 1880s, As frontier violence declined with improved law enforcement and social institutions, the Horrell story became cautionary tale. Contemporary newspaper editorials cited them as example of how family loyalty combined with violence could destroy communities and ultimately the perpetrators themselves. The surviving family members, including the brothers, mother, and wives, faced difficult futures according to available records. Property was lost, reputations destroyed, and association with Horrell name carried stigma. The violence had consequences extending far beyond the brothers themselves. The Horrell brothers' documented violence teaches specific lessons about frontier racial conflict, family-based criminality, legal system failures, and how violence escalates beyond control. Understanding what evidence actually shows versus accepting simplified narratives matters for historical honesty. First, the wedding massacre demonstrates how trivial provocations combined with racial tensions could trigger deadly violence. Contemporary accounts suggest the initial conflict was minor, but the Horrell's response was disproportionate and transformed what might have been contained incident into racial conflict killing dozens. Second, family-based organized violence was particularly difficult for frontier legal systems to address. The Horrells operated as unit, protected each other, intimidated witnesses, and had community support from ethnic allies. This pattern overwhelmed legal institutions designed for individual prosecutions. Third, racial bias in frontier justice was documented and explicit. Contemporary observers noted Anglo defendants were less likely to be prosecuted and convicted than Mexican Americans. This selective enforcement made legal resolution impossible and ensured violence would escalate through revenge cycles. Fourth, weak legal institutions couldn't contain escalating violence once it began. The pattern from Lampasas County repeated in Lincoln County because the Horrells faced no meaningful consequences for initial violence. Systems that couldn't punish initial crimes couldn't prevent subsequent violence. Fifth, economic and political interests protected violent families when they served powerful community members. The Horrells had Anglo-rancher allies who benefited from intimidating Mexican-American competitors. These interests prevented aggressive prosecution and ensured legal failures. If examining documented evidence about frontier racial violence changed your perspective on Old West justice, subscribe for more historical analysis that prioritizes court records and contemporary sources over romanticized legends. Next week, the documented reality of frontier race relations that proves the West wasn't the diverse paradise Hollywood claims.